I'm going to begin this morning a little bit different. I'm going to tell you a little short story about my son-in-law. Now, I asked him for permission to tell you this story, so it's okay. Ryan is the ultimate Vikings fan. I would call him, rather than a fan, a fanatic. I mean, he loves the Vikings. And during that first playoff game, I believe it was against New Orleans, if you remember, we were losing the game. As a matter of fact, I think everybody watching that game, both in the stadium and on television, just knew that game was lost. Now, Ryan and Beth and Riley had gone to watch the game on a big screen with a bunch of friends, and everybody knew it was game over. As a matter of fact, I understand Beth had taken Riley out of the room because Riley was sobbing. She takes after her dad, and tried to explain to her that sometimes you lose. Well, Ryan, on the other hand, took it this way. As they were nearing the end, he got in his car and started home. He told me later, he said, I just don't do well with a lot of people around me and having that loss. And he said, I just didn't want to handle it. I got in the car and started home. Well, of course, you know what happened. We had the miracle play in the last few seconds and won the game. Ryan missed it. Ryan was in the car listening on the radio and turned around and went back. Well, see what happened. Why did he miss it? He missed it because he'd lost all hope. He'd lost any hope of winning that game. And that makes me think of the question for all of us. When is the last time in some area of your life has it been game over? Has it been when you thought there's no hope of a comeback in my life? It's all hopeless. And maybe there are some of you here today that feel a little of that even today. And if you do, you're not alone. The fact is, on the first Good Friday, that was how Jesus' followers felt. Game over. It's done. There's no hope. And their hope died with him on the cross. And they were all hopeless. But then Jesus came back from the dead. Jesus conquered the grave. Jesus came out of that tomb. And when he rose to life, he brought hope back to life. They could have hope again, and we can. So for the next few minutes, I want us to look at John chapter 20, and we're going to see three different examples in that chapter of Jesus making appearances after he had risen from the dead. And he appeared to hopeless people in some hopeless situations. We're going to be looking at hope in some very unusual places. And on that first Easter, we see some unlikely places where Jesus showed up, and as soon as he came on the scene, everything changed. As soon as he comes on the scene of our lives, everything changes. I don't know where I'd be without him here today, but I know it wouldn't be here, and it wouldn't be in a good place. But I have hope, and I want to bring you some hope today. I want you to know that he can change things in your life no matter how hopeless the situation is. And he can do it right now. He can change your life this moment. He wants you to know that he can do that. He specializes in transforming hopeless situations, hopeless settings, and making them hopeful. We can have that. So the first place we're going to look is we're going to see hope showing up in a place of grief. Hope showing up in a place of grief. And it begins on that early Sunday morning, so many years ago. That early morning when Mary Magdalene went to the tomb. Went there for a couple of reasons. She went to continue the preparation for his burial because they had not been able to complete it. And she went there to grieve. But when she got there, the stone had been rolled away from the tomb, and the tomb was empty. Now, Mary's first thought was the body had been stolen. Somebody had come and taken the body of Jesus. And so now, even more grief, even more hopelessness is what she's facing. She was especially upset. John chapter 20, verses 11 through 16. Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They have taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they have put him." At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." Oh, Mary. She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Mary's heartbroken. Mary is in such grief that I think we can only imagine what she's going through. She is in such grief she doesn't realize that it's Jesus. And that is often the case when you see someone in a setting where you don't think they should be, where you're surprised that they are there in that setting. And in her case, Jesus is dead, and his body was in this tomb, and now the body's missing. And isn't it odd that the question would come, "Why are you crying?" It's not a question you normally would hear asked in a cemetery. Why are you crying? You know why somebody's crying. They're in grief. They're there because they've lost someone, someone that they care for, someone that meant a lot to them. And Jesus always meets us in our place of loneliness or loss. And that's why he asks her, "Why are you crying?" He wants to enter into her grief. He wants to help her. He wants to be there with her. And it's no different right here today. It's no different. He is asking you, why are you crying? What grief are you in? What is going on in your life? It's why it says in the Word in 1 Peter 5:7, "Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you." Now, I grew up not believing that Jesus cared for me. I grew up in a church where all I got was hammered home what horrible sinners we were, and fire and damnation and hell and all of that. That's how I grew up. So I didn't know when I got older, I really didn't, that Jesus really cares for me. He cares what's going on in your heart. He cares the grief that about the grief that you carry. Jesus really does. And when we see this account of Jesus with Mary, we begin to understand he's not just a powerful God, but he is a personal God. Yes, he has all the power in the universe. He spoke the universe into existence. He created you. He created me. But he also is a personal God who steps into your life and wants to help you through the tough times, wants to help you through the grief that you may have in your life. And we see that as he speaks Mary's name. He is speaking hope into the hopelessness that's in her heart. So if you're in a place of grief this morning, Jesus wants to express his care for you. He wants to express that into your life right now, today. And you may not be in a cemetery, but your grief may be going on in your home. You may be feeling grief there. Maybe a spouse has said, "I don't love you anymore." Maybe a spouse has left. Maybe you've lost a job. Maybe as my neighbor today is sitting in a hospital room waiting for his daughter to recover. And that hopelessness, that hopeless feeling that is there, trying to process what has happened. And you don't feel hope in those times when you're filled with grief. But Jesus will meet you there. I promise you. He will meet you there. And when he comes, he always brings hope with him. Jesus brings you hope. I read about a true story of two young men, two high school boys, who were killed in a tragic accident a couple of years ago, and were both killed together in a train car accident. One of the boys was a Christian boy. The other boy was raised without hope. And they decided that they were going to have funerals together. They had a double funeral. And the young man who wrote about it later, said it was the first time he'd ever been to a funeral, but he was a Christian. He had grown up as a Christian. And when he got there at the funeral, he said, you could see on one side of the room, the side where all the people were sitting for the boy that had been raised without hope, that the grief overwhelmed them and there was no consolation. They just cried out and mourned without any hope whatsoever. He said on the other side, the people grieved, but they did not grieve without hope. They grieved knowing that there will be life after death. And he said there was a stark contrast between those who had no hope and those who did have hope. What was the difference between the two groups? The difference, folks, is Easter. The difference is the empty tomb, that Jesus is alive. Paul explains it this way in 1 Thessalonians 4:13. Brothers and sisters, we do not want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death, so that you do not grieve like the rest of mankind who have no hope. Now I want you to notice that Paul does not say Christians don't grieve. He's not saying that at all. Christians do grieve, but he says don't grieve like the rest of the world. Don't grieve like those who have no hope. We have hope and we can grieve because we're going to be separated from a loved one, but it's temporary. It's not permanent. We have something to look forward to. This life is what's temporary, but we have permanent heaven forever in front of us. So Jesus will show up in your grief. And secondly, we find hope showing up in a place of fear. Remember, on that first Easter Sunday, the disciples, after finding the tomb empty, and we saw that video, did you notice? I really like the way they did in that video. I'm not sure which one was which disciple, but the disciple, I think it was John on the outside, was looking around. I like the way they did that because there was a lot of fear. There was fear of what was going to happen to them. After all, they had been with Jesus and they crucified Jesus. So they're all gathered together in a room in fear. And we often skip over what was going on in that room. What were they doing? They were hiding out, is what they were doing. They had the doors locked and they had this fear that the next knock on the door would be somebody coming with a cross that had their name on it. Because after all, thousands of people had seen them together with Jesus. Thousands of people knew that they were his followers. And they crucified him. What will they do to us? So there's a lot of fear in that room that day. Now in that setting, we're going to read John 20, verses 19 and 20. On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together, with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. You see, locked doors are no barrier to the one who just unlocked a grave. And now he stands in that room with them. He stands there resurrected. He stands there reunited with them. And they are in fear of their enemies. But here comes their closest friend. Oh, and by the way, he died 3 days ago. And their closest friend stands there with them. Think about the transformation that is taking place right there in that room. The transformation in their lives, in their thinking, in their feelings, in their attitudes. The transformation that is just about to take place. This group that had been huddled up and locked the doors and in fear of their lives are the ones that are used by God to change the whole world. He comes through their fear. He comes to them through their fear. They have now hope so strong that it has replaced their fear with faith. And they go on to be such bold witnesses that a number of them, almost all of them, died, martyred. They were hiding, but now they're out in the open and they would be martyred. They were that convinced of their hope beyond the grave. Now, there's one thing that is true of all of us. We all have fears, and we don't like talking about them. We don't like talking about the fears that we have. There are a lot of different fears. I used to be, of all things, my greatest fear at one point in my life was the fear of public speaking. And at that time, I flew everywhere. Didn't bother me a bit. I flew to Europe, I flew to Korea, I flew all over this world. Didn't bother me a bit. But public speaking, I remember when I was in OCS, Officer Candidate School in the Army, I had to speak to 4 guys. I had to and be graded on it, standing in front of 4 of my peers. And I almost fainted. I really did. You don't ever put your hands in your pockets in the Army, right? But I stood there with my hands in my pockets, rattling keys and coins in my pockets because I was just like this. I was so afraid. Fear comes from places that we don't always like to talk about. I have this fear of flying, but I'm overcoming it. I've been flying several times lately. So I get over it with the help of Jesus. We have fears of maybe going into a new school or a new job. We have fear when we move to a new city. We have to make new friends, and that's a fearful thing. As a matter of fact, there are over 700 listed medical names for different phobias, things that people are afraid of. And perhaps the strongest one is the fear of dying. They used to say it was the fear of public speaking, but I don't think so. I think it's the fear of dying. What's the reason for that? Why are we afraid of that? It's simple. We're afraid of the unknown. We don't know what's going to happen. And you couple that with the fact that the strongest instinct God put into us is that instinct of survival. So we have that instinct working with us, and then afraid of death itself. It's a basic drive that God gave all of us. And it helps us to understand why these disciples were in this room hiding out. Think about it. We are most fearful when we're in a position that we cannot control. And that's where they were. They couldn't control what was going to happen next. And so they were afraid. And most of us, I think, know what that's like. Something's going to happen in our lives. We see it coming. We know it's going to happen. And we're fearful. We get afraid. We can't do anything about it. It's beyond our ability. Maybe it's a health scare. Maybe it's something else happening in our lives and we want to fix it. We want to be able to push a button and make it go away. And we have this fear because we cannot make it go away. A spouse says, I don't love you anymore, and we want to do everything we can. We want to control them. We want to make them love us. And we can't. We can't push a button and make that happen. So it brings fear. And when we have fear is the time that we need to remember, as we were singing, Easter. When you are most fearful, it's time to remember that empty tomb. And it will help you through that fear, because when we put our hope in the right place, that is in Jesus, we're going to find that our faith begins to replace our fear. So our faith will help us through that. And we hear those words again, the first words that Jesus speaks to his disciples: peace be with you. What a comforting phrase. He gave them exactly what they needed when they needed it. And when I go through times where I am fearful and I don't know what's coming next, and there have been many of those times in this church, I don't know what's coming next, and God has always spoken to me through the empty tomb. Remember that Jesus is in control. Not you, Ed. Not you, church. Jesus is in control. Amen. And so I don't have to be fearful. What a cool thing for Jesus to say those words. Peace be with you. It's the one thing that they needed is what Jesus offered. And that's so typical of him. He is always delivering what no one else is expecting. And yet he meets all of our needs. I'm going to start a new series next Sunday based on the 23rd Psalm, living in the goodness of God. And I'm excited about it. I want to live in the goodness of God, and I know I can because the tomb's empty. And I can remember that. So in John 20, we see hope shows up in a place of grief, hope shows up in a place of fear, and hope shows up in a place of doubt. In verse 24 of John 20, we learn that there was one disciple that was not there. That disciple was Thomas. So when Thomas came back, when they got together again, all of his buddies tell him what had happened. And Thomas is going, no way. I'm not buying that. It's April Fool's Day. I'm not listening to that. So he thinks they just have wishful thinking. Maybe he thinks they hallucinated. But he expresses his doubt to them. In John 20, verse 25, he said to them, unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. Now, I like it that Thomas was willing to express his doubt. I like it that God chose to put that in the Bible. Because I think, most of the time we come to church on Sunday morning and we're all looking nice, feeling good, and it's not a place where we think we ought to be expressing our doubts. But you know what? Doubts do come. Be honest about it. They do happen. Sometimes people will go through a season of doubt. And we don't have to pretend about that. The truth is, we all have them once in a while. And this place needs to be a place where we can search for truth. This place needs to be a place where we are able to express what we're feeling. We're able to ask questions and get answers. This needs to be a place where we can express ourselves whatever is going on. The disciples were okay with Thomas. They were okay with him seeking evidence. He wanted some pretty strong evidence, but they were okay with that. It wasn't that Thomas didn't want to believe, but Thomas just needed some evidence. He needed to see something. I read this week about a preacher who was out running errands in his car, and he had his two little girls with him. And as he was out running his errands, he drove by a funeral home, and he pulled in and stopped. And he told his girls, he said, I need to run in for just a second. I won't be gone more than 10 minutes, but there's a family here who's lost their dad, lost their husband, and I just need to go in and give them a little encouragement, and I'll be right back. 10 minutes. Well, he gets inside the funeral home to find out it's the wrong funeral home. It's not the one where he thought this person's family was. So he's right back out to his car. And he says to his girls, you'll never guess what happened. And the little 5-year-old looked up at him with eyes wide and said, he's alive. Well, Thomas was not like her. Thomas's faith demanded a little more evidence. Writer Henry Drummond said, Christ always distinguished between doubt and unbelief. Doubt is I can't believe. Unbelief is I won't believe. There's a difference. Lee Strobel wrote the book, The Case for Christ. Also a movie made, a major motion picture made from that book. For 13 years was an investigative journalist for the Chicago Tribune. And all of his life he had been an atheist. His wife, on the other hand, became a Christian. Strobel later wrote, when she came home and told me she had become a Christian, 2 words came into my mind. The first one was an expletive. The second one was divorce. He said, I just couldn't handle it. He said, I began to ridicule her. I began to mock her. But finally, one day, through her persistence, I decided, I'll go to church with you one time. They said, my reason for going was to poke holes in Christianity. I was going to have some fun with her, to ridicule her some more. But he said, something happened to me that day, and I began to look at Christianity through the eyes of an investigative journalist. He decided, I'm going to separate myth from reality, and I'm going to examine the evidence, and I'm going to disprove this. That was his intention. He prayed, God, I don't even believe you are there, but if you are, I want to find you. I really do want to know the truth. So if you exist, please show yourself to me. What a great starting point for a skeptic. You know, a lot of times people will pray, God, if you're there, get me out of this hole. God, if you really exist, save my life. I don't believe those prayers go any higher than the ceiling. But when somebody prays, God, I don't believe you're there, but if you are, I want to find you. God hears that every time. I know He does because of what Jeremiah 29:13 says. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. You don't have to seek too long and too hard. God will show Himself to you. So that's the spirit of Thomas. I need more evidence. I want to know. I have these doubts. I just can't believe this. And then this happened in John 20:26-28. A week later, His disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. I believe what Jesus was doing, by the way, is giving Thomas the same thing He gave the rest of them. Peace be with you. The same experience. Then He said to Thomas, put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. Thomas said to Him, probably the greatest phrase in all the New Testament, my Lord and my God. What a scene that must have been. I don't know, you know, we're singing the song, I Can Only Imagine, and I don't know exactly what heaven's going to be like. I know some things from what the Bible says, but I can only imagine. One of the things I imagine and I hope is that God will show me things like this. I hope that God will take me to a point where He say, now watch, Ed, watch as I appear to him. I want to see that, my Lord and my God. And what, you know, I can only imagine, but I think tears were probably streaming down His face and sobs. I mean, he couldn't have just come out, oh, my Lord and my God. I'm sure there was a lot of emotion there. And when he saw Him, then Jesus told him in John 20, verse 29, then Jesus told him, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Who is that? That's right. I'm glad to hear that. Us. That's us. And we are blessed because of that. So Thomas had doubts, but Jesus met him where he was. Thomas then was convinced, and I know he was convinced because church history tells us that Thomas ultimately wound up in India preaching the gospel. And there in India was martyred for his faith. So he had faith. He had strong faith, even though he began with doubts. And Jesus, I think, would probably want to meet some of you here the way He met Thomas. He would want to meet some of you here the way He did on that first Easter and challenge you. Stop doubting and believe. Take that step and believe in Him. Investigators say that when you're investigating something and you find some evidence, you take a step in the direction the evidence is pointing. We see the evidence of a risen Savior. We need to take a step in that direction. I have been in many spiritual conversations with people who were lost. Over the years, I've sat and talked across a table, across a cup of coffee, in a living room, wherever. I have had multitudes of spiritual conversations with people. And I almost always have started that conversation with the question, if you died today, what would happen to you? But you know, I realize now that honestly, that is a question that is not on the forefront of most people's minds. So here's another question. What if you don't die today? What if you don't? What if you go on living on the same trajectory of your life for decades? What if you go on living with no purpose? What if you go on living with no meaning and no hope? What if you go on living a meaningless, mundane existence because you're going through the motions of life and missing out on Christ? What then? That's a better question, I think, because Christ can conquer anything. If Christ can conquer a grave, He can conquer any fears that you have, and He can give you purpose. He can give you a reason for living. He can resurrect a dead relationship. He can resurrect a career. He can resurrect a purpose. He can give you confidence. He can resurrect a marriage. He can resurrect anything. He can give your life purpose, and He can give your life hope. He can give your life meaning in the midst of your fear, in the midst of your doubting, in the midst of your grief. Last year there was a high school student, a young lady, who lost her battle with liver cancer. And at her funeral, her youth minister spoke. I want to read you a couple of the words that she spoke at that funeral. She said, there was this one night this past summer, we were driving to my house, and the girl's name was Amzie. I've never heard that name before. A-M-Z-I-E. She said, this past summer we were driving to my house, and Amzie told me she was feeling a little bit scared and asked if I was too. I told her I wasn't, but I lied a little. The truth is, on that night in particular, I felt my heart crumbling under the pressure to always wear a brave face, and I was held captive by the anxiousness that our friendship was experiencing. Our friendship was experiencing some of its last things. As we pulled up to my house and walked through the hallway, we passed 3 pictures that have been fixtures in my home for as long as I can remember. And they're just simple photos inside of frames that say faith, hope, and love. And as she made her way down the hallway, her shoulder brushed up against one of the frames, knocking it from the wall and shattering it to pieces on the floor. She apologized profusely as we bent over to pick up the glass, and she turned it over and said, I broke hope. But I pulled the picture from the glass and I said, no, you didn't. It was just the frame. And she continues, I have no doubt today that the Lord used that moment to speak something over my life and to calm my anxious heart and to teach it something it will never forget. Frames are fragile, and our frames are fragile. But when hope is inside of us, everything else around us can break, but not our hope. Can't break our hope. It was said that Amzie's hope grew stronger the closer she moved toward her own death. Why? Why would that be true of this young lady? Because she believed these words, Romans 5, 3-5. Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance, character, and character, hope. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. Her hope was in the one who conquered the grave. On Friday, Satan thought he'd won. Satan was glorying in the fact that Jesus had been nailed to a cross, that Jesus was dead, and Satan thought he had won. But Satan had merely broken the frame. He had not broken hope. Our hope is alive and well. And there will come a day for all of us when our frame is broken, whether it's at 17 or 75. Our frame will one day be broken. And on that day, the only thing that will matter is whether your hope is in Jesus Christ or not. That's all that will matter on that day. A tomb may be an unusual place to look for hope, but once you find it there, you'll start seeing hope show up in every part of your life.